honestly, y'all, we're going to kind of do this in doing it live style. I went through and modified my slides a little bit to put in some stuff that I typically talk about in a lot of presentations around anything with PowerShell. It's one of those things I would rather cover a couple of more basics and make sure I explain some things than skip over it and completely lose people from the beginning. But let's go ahead and get started. Let me find my screen. Let's go ahead and share. Okay, you guys seeing slides?
Yes, sir.
Alrighty, cool. So, howdy y'all. For those of you who don't know me, I am Joe Houghes, and I'm here to lead this presentation that's entitled From PowerCLI to API. This is really all about taking your automation skills to the next level. Why are you auto-advancing on me? Do not do that. But honestly, for most of us, especially if you're already doing some PowerShell and PowerCLI, this is really just about taking your skills to the next step in reality. It's nowhere near as impressive for a slide title. So let's go ahead and get into it. Who am I? Again, I'm Joe Houghes. I work for Pure Storage as a senior solutions architect currently. Honestly, what's more relevant for this presentation, I'm a co-leader of the, well, still, I guess, attached to the Austin PowerShell user group, but the Denver PowerShell and VMware user groups. And I am really just kind of a serial collector of communities. I'm a guy who likes figuring things out. I enjoy playing with all sorts of tech, hence the full stack geek moniker. And I like sharing back with the communities, right? That's been my main involvement with VMUG over the past couple of years. Like other VMUG leaders, I try and put on events like this to just help get people involved and give back to the community. Oh my God, why are these things advancing on me? Hold up. What is going on here? Do not do this. Okay, let's try this again. We're just going to share my screen. Okay. And in the end, really what I'm trying to do is just make sure that everybody is kind of understanding, you know, the background of what we've used in the past with PowerCLI on this stuff and where you go from here. I try and present this, especially for folks that are completely new to PowerShell or that know some PowerShell but have not really worked with APIs much before. The big thing here is basically taking a skill that you already have, a thing that you already know, and getting to the point that you can use that and can leverage the things that you already know to learn some new things, right? So let's go ahead and get into the basics of PowerShell. Starting at the beginning here, right? We want everybody to define a goal. You want to think about tasks that you're trying to accomplish and measurable results, right? We want to be, you know, very explicit about the things that we're trying to do here. Speed and performance are an advantage, but not really the benefit of putting a lot of your stuff in code. Your focus really should be on standardization, validating what you're doing, and then the efficiencies that you gain with making changes. For those changes, you want these to be small incremental changes that you can verify so that you actually know what the results are that you're getting from these changes as you make tweaks throughout. This is going to be something we're definitely going to talk about as we start talking about just making performance improvements on the things we're already doing in PowerShell to switch from PowerCLI cmdlets to using API objects still within PowerShell. And especially once we get to the API, I'm going to cover an example where it's super, super basic and the things that you do at the first step are not actually something that's really functional for you from then on. But you can make small changes from there and see your progress as you go. Don't forget the PowerShell basics, especially for anybody who has kind of learned PowerShell on the fly, for anybody who didn't go through and use what's kind of become the beginner's Bible for PowerShell of like learn PowerShell in a month of lunches, right? Get help as your friend and it makes your life easier. You always want to just try and go through and look at how to use a commandlet and look at how to do this through the examples that are already provided for you. It makes it a lot easier for you to understand what sorts of thing you're trying to do. And it gets you to this next point that I've got here of PowerShell being built for the pipeline, right? You want to embrace and utilize that. By using Git help and also using things like Git member, you know what sorts of objects that you're working within PowerShell to know how you can connect these things together. For anybody who is previously a bash or shell or even VB scripter, for those of us that are still around that have been in it for that long, PowerShell is different, right? It's object oriented. So the things that you see on screen are not strictly text. These are rich objects that have properties and methods where you can look at additional information that's not shown to you on screen at first. And you have methods that are actions you can take across these objects. So you're going to want to know how to get in and how to utilize these pieces that are there and all this functionality. Stack your commandlets and results like Legos, right? I try and, well, so number one, I got called out on this many, many years ago, but I still like to put it into my slides. The first feedback I ever got for a user presentation at a conference was that the plural of Lego is, the plural of Lego is Lego. So I leave this one in here just because I really like trolling the guy who gave me that feedback, because I know it irks him. But the point here is, if you think about the newer Lego sets, for anybody that can happen to see up here, along this shelf behind me is the Voltron Lego set, right? So not only is it Voltron, it's 5 pieces that combine together to make one really awesome robot. But if you go through all of these, each of these components has a book of stuff. Oh my God, come on. When you put all these pieces together, there's going to be all sorts of small components that are inside of these pieces that you're never going to know, right? There's tons of different colors of Lego. There's all sorts of teal and pink and things like that when you get to the end result, it's like black and gray, right? But there are subcomponents that are inside of all of these things. So you're going to have some commandlets where you're going to pull out specific pieces of information and put this stuff together. Your end result is not necessarily going to show everything that makes up all of it, or all of the different steps and iterations that you went through to get to your final result or your finished script. And then forget whatever your teachers told you, right? You want to cheat and look up the answer whenever possible. What I mean by this is look at the examples through Get Help in PowerShell. You want to go through and read books. You want to read blog posts that people have shared a lot of this stuff. Those of us that have been through the pain of figuring these things out or beating our head against the desk because we even had a typo or something like that somewhere in here, want to share this information back and make it easier for somebody else. But also to do something in code, really what we're wanting you to capture is like, here's the thing that I figured out how to do once, so I don't have to do that again. If to do that one time, you go create something in a GUI and then figure out how to pull it out and put it back into code, that is totally fine, right? Whether we're talking about PowerShell or the API, many times you're going to go look up other things that already exist, or inside of a clean environment, right? Where, say for this demo environment, I have a demo nested ESXi host. I've got a cluster. I've got single vCenter VM inside of it and a kind of a dummy Windows VM inside of there. But for some of this stuff, it's easier for me to create the demo code for this by just going and looking up the initial objects that I created to go grab the values, because it's easier for me to just look at what's there and modify to then put out the demo code that runs the actual instances for all of these things. So don't try and force yourself to do everything strictly through code. Go get the answer wherever you can, right? Now, as we get into the APIs, really what we're talking about here is which API is it that we're going to work with, right? So we're going to talk about the history of the APIs within vSphere itself, right? So on the left side here, we've got the SOAP API. This is an older API. It is actually a protocol and a standard that's built around SOAP, that stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. These were the original APIs, right? They've been in vSphere since the early days of, God, I couldn't even tell you when SOAP API was first built and accessible through everything, was around like the ESX 3 to 4 days. This is what gets used when you're using things like PowerCLI or PyVMommy, right? It is all XML based, so it's more rigid. It is not as simple as it's described in the name, but it's going to be an instance where you're going to find many more examples of your usage that you can pick up and learn from, just because of the fact that these have existed for so many years. All of the PowerCLI books that were written, like all the great stuff from Alan Renouf and Brian Graff and things like that, all the tech marketing guys that did heavy PowerCLI stuff, it's all based around SOAP. So you're going to find a lot of examples that are leveraging the SOAP API just because of the length of time that it's been around. But one of the things that I like to use SOAP for is to explain vSphere objects and APIs to anybody, right? It's very helpful for people to just get in the mindset of understanding, again, that the results you get back from PowerShell and the .NET objects that you get within PowerShell, you're going to see those come back from a lot of your PowerCLI commandlets, but they're going to be slightly different than what you get back as a raw vSphere object if you were working with one of the REST APIs directly. So when you use something like a get-vm commandlet versus running get-view in a view type of virtual machine, the information that comes back is slightly different. But the information you get back from PowerCLI commandlet, you actually have the ability to get into that extension data, and you can see essentially what the API is using on the back end. As we flip over to the new APIs, the REST API itself is going to be the architecture that like all of the new APIs are using. Anybody who gets into a vCenter server and uses the API Explorer, you're going to be leveraging the REST APIs. This is an architecture for the APIs. This is not a strictly defined protocol. There's a standard for REST APIs, kind of, but it's not a very rigidly defined thing the way that XML was and has to be. The REST API is really a methodology of how things should work. This is, again, us talking about context and like text-based representation of objects, similar to what we have inside of PowerShell when we're working with objects there. It's just that on REST, it's accessible over web protocols, right? It's intended to be a lot easier, and it's going to resolve a lot of the issues that we had with SOAP APIs, but it's not a defined standard. God, okay, I'm gonna have to fix this deck. I don't know why it's trying to auto advance on me all the time. There will be some features that are accessible only via REST because that's the new architecture for all of the APIs going forward. So some of this stuff is not going to get backported into the SOAP API. Some of it's not going to be backported into native PowerCLI commandlets as quickly as it's going to be accessible through the REST API. So if you know how to access these things, even via PowerShell, you can really consume things as they are available inside of vSphere without waiting for an update to the PowerCLI modules. We're going to cover an example of this where I show some PowerShell code that's essentially like a simple wrapper for SSH to make a change on the BCSA, where it's a few lines of code to make the change over an SSH session. But then to make it run inside of PowerShell, we're using an open source module. We have a bunch of wrapper code and all sorts of things like this. But when we go handle it through the API, we're essentially setting like enable or disable and giving it a timeout. And that's it. So we want to have a comparison to just say, here are some of the advantages of moving over to leveraging APIs, even when we're all still doing this just within a PowerShell console. So working with the REST API will also translate to other APIs outside of vSphere. Again, this is us using what we know already. We understand the PowerShell side of it. We understand the object layouts. We can compare what we see in a PowerShell console from GitView or with that extension data to what we see in the API Explorer. And you're now going to see essentially the same objects from PowerCLI to what you show in the API documentation. So it makes it a little bit easier for us to kind of do a translation and learn some things about the APIs. So it also helps us to understand and interpret their documentation and how we do things working with an API natively. It's really good to learn on something like the VMware platform or vSphere products, because we all have a decent amount of background knowledge. There's a lot of things you can learn about in the tool there, and then just use a different access method to it to get you a little bit more knowledgeable about APIs. And then once you have that base knowledge, you can start consuming other APIs for other products. So for a quick list of tools, what we're going to be using here, PowerShell, obviously, in the PowerCLI modules. I really buried the lead on the title. We're going to work with a lot of this interactively on the console. So it's going to be running some scripts to show where we can make some more difficult parts be a little bit easier. We can make the code modular. We can show how we can start trying to migrate from just the PowerCLI commandlets to doing things where we're essentially accessing data directly from the APIs. And just minor incremental changes that will show us great improvement. But again, it's small things that we can do to make these performance improvements. We don't have to just immediately cut everything over to consuming APIs. We're going to do a couple of quick hits on the vCenter and VCSA APIs. We're going to start looking at the older SOAP API again to do performance improvements of just modifying our existing PowerCLI code to make it run a little bit faster. We're going to make some tweaks against the VCSA API, both with PowerShell with some wrapper code and natively through the API itself through the Explorer. And then we'll make sure that we make a distinction of the appliance API versus the vCenter API. We'll get to that when we get into the documentation, because it's a couple of different APIs that exist on the VCSA appliance, depending on what it is that we're trying to do. Now, as for other components, obviously we're going to be working on a vCenter server. We're going to leverage the VMware API Explorer. This is going to be on your vCenter server. If you're running essentially anything that's version 7 or above, you're going to see this under Developer Center, I think is the button. I'll show you guys where to pull it up. We're going to pull up some VMware documentation. But the nice thing about doing all of this, especially having just the VMware documentation open next to the API Explorer, is that we don't need another tool to do this stuff on our vCenter server. We're going to be doing some copy and paste and just doing things interactively. You copy, the code that you're trying to dump in there for the methods that you're sending to it, and click a button that says execute. That's it. But then when we're comparing things from the API Explorer to what we're doing inside of PowerCLI, it makes it a little bit easier for us to understand how to read and grasp the things in the VMware documentation. So developer.vmware.com and code.vmware.com are great links because you can see online versions of the API Explorer, or at least a matching version of the documentation, so you can compare. And you do it online, you can look at different versions of the documentation. So if you're running 7.0, 3 versus 2, or if you want to go back and compare to your old 6.7 hosts, if you still have some around, you can flip through that documentation by version to see what's applicable to your version of vCenter that you're going to be running across your environment, whereas the API Explorer is only going to show you what exists on that singular vCenter server. Code.vmware.com has all sorts of things. For example, code, you can look at PowerShell, you can look at Python, you can get into Perl if anybody wants to. One of the things that's really good for us here as we're talking about APIs is there are Postman collections where you can basically import in a couple of JSON files, and it will give you all sorts of examples that you can follow along by setting a few variables. You can interact against the API for your vCenter server, and it's actually using like a full REST tool. We'll cover Postman. I'm not importing into collections, but we're going to do some simple interactions with Postman so that we can get completely outside of PowerShell, and you can see what it looks like to consume an API just with Postman and doing a little bit of investigation. And then also in the demos, VS Code is the code editor that I'm using for this. And then I use a show object commandlet that exists inside of the PowerShell cookbook module from the PowerShell gallery. That's just to make it a little bit easier because I do some stuff where we want to show the tree hierarchy of all of these objects. So let's go ahead and get to the demos. Let me switch my share to my screen. And let's make sure that everybody can see. All right. You guys see a code window, hopefully?
I do.
All right. Okay. So first, here's the documentation page that I was talking about for developer.vmware.com. This is the API reference. So just go to developer.vmware.com, click on API reference up here. We're going to see 2 APIs here on the top left that are going to be the ones we're primarily working with. The vSphere Web Services API, this is going to be what's going to exist for the older SOAP API and everything that is wired up for native PowerCLI commandlets, especially all the core stuff that's been around forever, like git-vm. This vSphere Automation API that's here in the middle, this is going to be all of the vSphere REST APIs that are now rolled into the VCSA, right? So this is what we're going to be interacting with when we get to the API Explorer. Just want to make sure everybody at least understands, these are the 2 primary links you're going to be looking for when you're starting to play around with this stuff, or if you're following any of these examples. Now for this vSphere Web Services API, let me go ahead and go back to the top. So on this page here for this documentation, you're going to see a lot of stuff that's here. This is up-to-date documentation, but this has been around for a very, very, very long time. So some of this stuff has been kind of kicked along since like the 4.0 or 4.1 days. Older documentation type for anybody that's been in IT or has dealt with a lot of stuff, even back to like Server 2000. Think of this documentation as more similar to what you would see in one of the old compressed HTML documents that would see as like a help menu for old Exchange stuff and things like that, right? So it's very text-based, written almost as if it was a Word document and you have to like click through the links to get around. It's not quite as nice and easy as the newer API docs are. But we want to start with understanding manage object types, right? So let me zoom in a little bit here. So the vSphere management object model has these data structures, right? Like it says here, it's used to provision, manage, monitor, and control the lifecycle of all components that can possibly comprise virtual infrastructure. Really what this is that everything starts at this root service instance module that's over here on the left, the big green box. Then you're going to get to capabilities or service contents that you have. And the two managed object types that we're going to deal with are managed entities, which are going to be like the inventory of all of our components, right? Our hosts, our VMs, our networks, anything that we're potentially going to interact with, or something that's going to have a configuration to it, that there's going to be one or more instances inside of your environment, will be a managed entity object type. These managed objects that are the second type here are services for the entire system, right? Think of this being your performance manager, your license manager, your virtual storage manager, your alarm manager, things like that. So there's a distinction of which are services and which are inventory objects inside of here. Really, all you want to know is that there can be a difference where there's one endpoint that you're going to touch for some of these services, things like licensing or your alarm manager, versus there being inventory of individual things like VMs where you're going to work with one or many across here. Some of this makes a little bit more sense as we actually like dig into the code and kind of see this. But this is just me wanting everybody to understand, like, this is where we started with PowerCLI. These are the things that we were dealing with. And these managed object references are essentially kind of like a shell object, right? An empty object that doesn't actually have any instances, but it contains all of the properties and methods that any true data object inside of our environment would have. So really, when this gets down to it, if anybody has ever worked with PowerCLI a lot in the past, or if you've even worked with things like Veeam or some of the other storage providers that have tie-ins where they identify stuff by the particular virtual machine, you've probably seen a managed object reference ID or a MoRef ID. Essentially, think of that being like the serial number of a virtual machine inside of your environment. Especially with Veeam, where I came from in the past, when you would migrate a VM from one vCenter to another, what we show you inside of the user interface is the name of a virtual machine, but the way that we actually access it and kept it in the database for which job a virtual machine is supposed to be inside of for backups is using that MoRef ID. So when you migrated from one vCenter to another, that ID changes. So you have to essentially go modify that on the back end, right? It's like a serial number, and it's just for us to kind of be aware of where things are and where they're tied to. So that's enough for this right here. Let's flip back into some code. So for a side-by-side comparison, I'm going to basically show everybody this is what it looks like for getting the .NET objects that are accessible through just a simple native PowerCLI commandlet, where we're going to go get our VMs. So $VMs equals get-VM. And then we're going to feed this into get snapshot. And then we're selecting the VM name and then the description for the snapshot itself. On the right side, we're doing this through get view, right? Essentially, this means we're connecting directly to the API to get this information back, rather than going through all the layers with .NET and having to do translations back. So to make this a little bit easier to understand, we're going to do $VMs, and we're going to look at the first instance of this. So this is a vCenter server that I have inside of my environment. Now, what you're looking at here, what comes back natively, just because this is PowerShell formatting, is when I look at a VM inside of an environment, it gives me back the name, the power state, number of CPUs, and how much memory is assigned to this thing. Now, I can go look at all of the properties by piping this to format list, and this will give me back all of the information that exists on this .NET object that's an interpretation of this virtual machine. So it gives me things like my name, the power state, the memory, but it also starts telling me which host it's in, which folder, what's the hardware version, and things like that, right? Again, still a more restricted view of what this is versus what we get inside of here to do VMs 0 from the vSphere object that comes back. Here I've got things like my capability, my config, my layout extension data, information about the storage, and then it gets to like storage, the summary, the data store, the network, the snapshot. Basically, it says from this virtual machine, these are probably the categories of things that I'm looking for rather than individual pieces of information that are just plugged back in as a string the way that they are inside of PowerShell. Another really good way to kind of understand this is to use our get member, which lets us investigate what the object types are, right? This is back to core PowerShell.NET stuff of reflection. When I look at the type name that comes back from git-vm, it's a vmware.vimautomation.vicore.implementation.v1.vm.universal virtual machine implementation. It's a mouthful, right? But if this is just showing you like, here's a specific version of an implementation of a virtual machine that comes back. If I do the same thing over here, from what comes back from the vSphere API itself, not only do you see all the different methods and properties that come back, but it's a vmware.vim.virtual machine, right? It's much closer to the object that's actually contained in the database and that you would access inside of the API, because that is the focus of it, is, you know, looking at it via the API rather than looking at it through like a .NET filter, right? Inside of the virtual machine on the API side, we're going to have some interesting tasks and methods. Whereas on the .NET side, the methods that we have just relate to a PowerShell object, right? Like turning it to string or getting the type of the object. Whereas on the virtual machine on the right side that we're getting through get_view, since this is coming back from the API, the methods we actually have here are like acquiring a ticket to get to the console, right? Answering a VM question, cloning the VM, creating snapshots and things like that. A lot of the interactions that you would try and do on a VM, most of these that would end up being somewhere in a right-click menu, those are going to be natively accessible directly on this object on the right side because we're getting it through get_view and because it's in the API itself. So just a distinction there. The other thing to be aware of, again, as we're talking about making minor incremental changes to our code to see some really big results here, what I did with this on the left and the right side was just run a stopwatch, right? After we've connected to our server, start a stopwatch to see how long it takes for us to get information about get_vm and then getting the snapshot information. On the right side, it's get_view and then get the same snapshot information. But running it through the .NET code, running it through the PowerCLI commandlets, on the left side, it's 6.16 seconds to get that information back about my VMs and the snapshots. On the right side, it's 1.93 seconds, right? So small example, don't take this to be like the end all be all, but things will run faster when you're accessing the native APIs rather than doing everything through PowerCLI commandlets. So to give a better side-by-side comparison of what it is that we see back on these, we're going to just kind of run the same thing again. So I want to look for the particular VM that's like my jump box inside of this environment on both sides. So again, the .NET view of this thing on the left side, it gives me a pre-formatted output because that's defined by PowerShell of the name, the power state, CPU's memory. On the right side, I get the actual virtual machine object as it is shown in the API, and it says, here are essentially all of the categories of information that you're trying to get to. When I really want to start digging into this thing, especially as I'm trying to start converting my code from native PowerCLI commandlets to start leveraging the APIs, this show object tool is a fantastic thing that you can use that will show you this tree view of all of this that we have. So from the API itself, I can look and I can say, oh, like here's all the different categories of information. Maybe I'm trying to find the snapshot information. Oh, that might be under snapshot that's here. Oh, cool. Here's my current snapshot. Here's like the type that it is. Here's the value being the ID, the MoRef ID for that snapshot. Here's the list that shows me the tree for all of the other snapshots that exist inside of here. There's only one here. But if I want other information about like how this relates to the storage, maybe I'm going to go look at the storage itself. Well, no, this instead gives me per data store usage. But now I can say, oh, on this data store with this ID, here's my committed, uncommitted, shared, unshared disk usage that's here. But maybe I'm looking more for like file layout. Ooh, this gives me the information about my configuration files, all of my log files, like what's the actual layout for the disk versus what's the layout for the snapshot itself. Different information you may be trying to get depending on what it is you're reporting from. But when you use some different tools, right, whether you use this show object that gives you kind of a browsable tree view for this, or when you do some custom formatting to be able to lay this out inside of the console and have it show you the hierarchy of all of these rich objects that you can drill into, it makes it a lot easier to find a lot of this information and put it together. And really, the last thing I want to show you guys here, just to show you how to do this conversion, is when you look at this information on the left side versus the right side, whether I'm doing it through .NET or I'm doing it through the API, I can get this same exact information here. The only thing that changes in my code, doing it in PowerShell through a native PowerCLI command to get my VMs themselves versus what I'm doing through the .NET object, or sorry, through the API object that comes back, is through PowerCLI, I have to go into this extension data property. But once I do that, if I go to my .NET VM extension data, the list of what I have here is exactly what comes back from my API object that comes back from GetView, right? So making a conversion over to this, you can even just start modifying and say, all I need is my VM objects and I can go pull out information. I don't have to pipe my VM objects to absolutely everything else to start running multiple commandlets and get things back and forth. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead a little bit. We're going to get into some other commandlets. So this is one that I just kind of wanted to show a reference of, again, showing how much quicker things can be when you're running stuff from .NET through the API. So for .NET objects for this one, I'm going to go to, again, my simple demo vCenter environment that's got just, a handful of VMs on it. And I'm doing kind of the same thing, right? Get the VMs, get the snapshots, get the disks. Whoops, I'm in the wrong. Oh, okay, I was already in the right directory. So for that, all I'm doing is, again, getting the snapshots that exist, which was one inside of this environment, and getting all the disks for the 2 VMs that are inside of here. And that took me like 0.87 seconds. Doing some different stuff that was actually compiled in a script that's here. This is kind of a lightweight rewrite of RV tools, right? It's getting me information about my VMs. It's getting me information about all the disks for the VMs. It's getting me information about my data stores, my clusters, my ESXi hosts. Like, there's a little bit of everything that's inside of this thing that comes out and gets outputted to some CSV files. That took 3.6 seconds to dump all of this information. And it's all just wrapped up and gets, just dumped out into CSV files. And all of that was just through some copy and paste and poking around with show object to go find things and essentially just go add some additional properties to figure out what it was I was trying to find on the hosts and where some of these things were. But again, this was primarily because in some customer environments, people either flat out didn't know about RV tools or didn't have it, or it wasn't allowed to run inside of those environments. So I had to give somebody some kind of pure native PowerShell code, or where PowerCLI was allowed because it was a tool that was directly related to vSphere. So from that, we could produce the same sorts of output, and it was still pretty quick and lightweight and easy because we were accessing things from the API itself. Now we're going to skip over and we're going to start actually accessing the APIs through PowerCLI. So let me bump up my font size a little bit here so everybody can see a little bit better. Oops, now of course. All right. So in this code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go query the health information for my VCSA. This bit that I have here at the top, let me zoom this in a little bit more, is really just around dealing with the self-signed cert, right? Because that's what I have for this environment. It's a very simple, basic environment I spun up. I'm giving it information for the vCenter server that I'm going to go get to. I'm giving it the base URL that I'm trying to pull information from, of just being the REST endpoint. And then inside of here, where I can pull it out from the documentation, I'm getting into like com/vmware/sys/session. What this comes from is when we go look at the vSphere API documentation, on the main page for the vSphere automation API, right? For the first time, you're going to go interact with the APIs inside of vCenter. This is a very simple workflow, right? It shows you how to create a session to authenticate to the API endpoint, how to use that session ID in different calls, and then how to create a virtual machine. We're going to actually go through and do all of this like interactively, but this will walk you through all the steps. So hopefully seeing this run interactively and going back and comparing it to the documentation later on makes it easier for you to be able to follow along with some of the stuff. But this just tells us authenticate, get a session ID. We're going to stash this in a variable. We're going to feed it back and go get some different information. For what we're doing in PowerShell right now, we're going to get health information rather than create a VM. We're going to do the VM a little bit differently. But so let me go ahead and run all my self-signed stuff. At this point, when this runs, this will ask me for a credential for me to put in. So that's the prompt that comes up for it. So I'm going to run my VMUG demo at vSphere. As long as I can type, which I cannot do today. Bang. Okay, now what I have saved inside of here is the session header, which was the authentication token that came back, and me just formatting it in here to say, this is what I'm trying to get back. My session header. Okay, so inside of this header, I now have the key name for this being this VMware API session ID, which is what's documented here in the documentation, that we need to give it back along with the session ID that actually came back. So that's all we're doing here, right? Is our header is now session ID equals the response we got back from authenticating with the username and password. At this point, all I'm doing here is setting my endpoints to say that in the API itself, I'm going to go to the appliance API for these. I'm going to the system for 2 of these, and I'm getting the version of what the VCSA is. I'm getting the uptime of what it is. And in this last one, I'm going to the health endpoint and getting the appliance management information. So all I'm doing here is just go copy and paste. We're running this with native PowerShell. It's running invoke REST method. So we're starting off with get methods because all we're doing is pulling information. We're not changing or modifying anything inside of this environment. And now that I have this information, I can just browse around, right? So I want to go look at my version. Oops, let's see. Oh, whoops, yeah, I didn't grab my, here, let's just look at the responses actually. We can show how we can navigate through this. So my version response comes back in this not great formatted information. So if I drill into the value of this, we can see back the summary that we get. Here's the patch level for our vCenter server that we have. Here's the specific build. Here's the release date that it was, because all of this information is stored in the API. It's essentially going to be the same exact stuff you're going to see through the GUI when you click like about vCenter. But if I'm trying to use this in code, or I'm trying to use this for validation for something else, and I want to get back to just the specific version number, I can get back just that string by just kind of digging through the tree of all this hierarchical information to get to the specific thing that I'm wanting. Same thing for let's do, here, let me go ahead and save these things. At this point, we can look at our info for the builds and everything like that. Let's look at our build information that will pull out just that specific build number from the version response.value.build information, right? If we want to look at uptime, the uptime will give us essentially the number of seconds that this environment's been up and running. And then health will actually give us this health response gives us a value that's essentially a green, yellow, red, right? Think about if you're using this for dashboarding information, or if you're even trying to put this into a spreadsheet, you can take some of this very basic information and easily populate. And once you've created this one time, right, then it's you just figuring out how to target different stuff inside of your environment to be able to do a lot of this quickly and easily on the fly. Next, like I mentioned, here is the PowerShell code that I wrote that is an SSH wrapper for basically trying to enable the shell on a VCSA, right? So for an environment where we have SSH enabled, but do not have the bash shell enabled, this was a request from somebody to help them try and figure out, hey, I have SSH, but I'm trying to figure out how through PowerShell I can flip it over to the bash shell so that I can go run some commands and then flip it back. So in the end, all the commands that we need to change it to bash are logging into the VCSA, typing out shell, typing out this change shell to /bash/root, and then logging out. To switch it back to the native appliance shell, you essentially log in, you're already in bash, so you're already in a shell prompt. You do, change shell back to appliance shell root and then log out. That's all that it is, but this is, 60 lines of code that I did in PowerShell to run 2 lines of SSH or 3 lines of SSH, depending on which way I'm trying to flip this thing. Whereas to do this inside of the API is much, much easier. So we're going to just navigate through it real quick to at least show everybody what it is we're talking about here. And then, 40 minutes. Okay, cool. So we got just enough time to get through this. All right. So for this, since what we're working on is the actual VCSA appliance itself and some of those services, we're going to pick the appliance API. Right here, for the most part, for most people, especially when you're getting started, you're going to be working with either the appliance API if you're trying to modify things on the VCSA itself, or like try and kickstart a service or something, or do an update of your vCenter environment, or you're going to be working with vCenter because you're actually going to be interacting with things like your virtual machines, your clusters, your hosts, and things like that. So we'll flip over to the appliance API. And then for this access SSH, we just want to make sure that this is showing us that SSH is enabled. So we will just go to our get method. We'll hit execute. We'll pull this back. And here I'm getting an error type. Oh, whoops, unauthenticated. Yeah, sorry, my session timed out. Let me log back in. The benefit of doing this stuff through the API Explorer rather than through code is that when you're authenticated to the vCenter GUI, you're already going to be authenticated inside of the API Explorer. And to get to that, you just hit your drop-down menu again on vSphere 7. You'll go to Developer Center. That will drop you straight in here to the overview. Then you click over to API Explorer. You're now in the API Explorer. From here, you can interactively go run code to actually go create virtual machines or play with your VCSA services and things like that. So let's execute this again. Okay, status 200. Okay, so this shows me that it now pulled back information. It shows me that my SSH service is enabled because that's the response code that it gives me here. So SSH is enabled, but my shell service should not be enabled. So if I go execute here, it's going to give me back the actual configuration for it. Come on. Oh, lovely. Okay. Here, let me flip over to another vCenter server real quick. Wanted to have a backup just in case, because this stuff always happens with demos. Okay. Refresh to make sure I'm still logged in. So at this point, really all I'm trying to do here is to show you how to get some information from the API. We're actually going to go interact with this. Is this going to give me the same thing? Yeah, hold on. Unauthenticated. Fun. All right, let's log out. Let's log back in. Okay, at this point, I'm going to say I'm still getting through the demos, but if anybody has any questions or anything we want to ask about, if there's anything that I can explain better for y'all, please let me know. I'll take this as a good sign rather than I've completely lost everybody, just, because it's always better to assume that.
This is good stuff, Joe.
I try and show everybody that even with my demos that might go sideways, there's typically some decent information you can get about this. Man, why are we still getting... Oh, I wonder if they, you know what, they may have modified this to show as blank because there's no current config on this thing. So you know what, we can, again, we can also cheat on some of this stuff. So let's go pull up inside of the VMI just so we can validate what information we're getting back. All right. So let's remember the password on this one. Nope. Okay, there we go. There we go. Sorry, access. Yep. Okay, so SSH enabled, bash shell disabled. So it's giving me back no information on this thing. Now, the change that we're going to do for this, we're actually going to leverage a different method inside of PowerShell to do this, right? To interact with the API services in a more PowerShell fashion, rather than having to do invoke REST method and typing in a bunch of things that are specific to APIs. PowerCLI came out with some new commandlets. So the Connect CIS server will let us interact with these services. So let me go dig into my demo vCenter server. And I'm going to define a variable that says I'm going to get this specific CIS service, which is com.vmware.appliance.access.shell. Essentially from the docs, that's just converting back everything that you see here, like com dot starts before any of the APIs you're actually referencing. So I get into the appliance, and then from there it's, you know, access/cell. So you can kind of figure out how it is you're getting to everything. Sorry, com.vmware, not just com. But anybody who's played with a lot of .NET and PowerShell stuff, this is probably not completely foreign to you. But from this shell service, I can see that it is a service base, and it has some code methods to it for like getting and setting the access shell itself. So I'm going to go ahead and get what the current config on this thing is. And then again, to make it a little bit easier for everybody to see what it is that's actually defined in this thing. Inside of here, there's a help doc. There's a value of true or false. It's a Boolean value for whether or not the shell access is enabled. And then there's a timeout. So now we're actually going to access this help method so we can see what it is that we're supposed to do, right? So it shows us that we can set, and it shows we can get. And then if we want to figure out what exactly we're trying to do for set, we just do help.set. And this tells us this will set it to enabled. And we have to give it a definition of what this is, right? So inside of this definition or this config file, we want to see what this is. So let's go to set.config and then get the member. So there's a note property here for enabled, and there's a note property for timeout on how to set this thing. So to create a new instance of this, I'm going to set a variable of shell config equals my shell service dot help dot set dot config, and then there's this create method, which gives me essentially an empty object that is formatted properly that I can then tweak. So if I now look at my shell config, we'll see that it has enabled, but it's unset, and it has timeout and it's unset, but both of these are required. The enabled property, again, is a Boolean. The timeout is a long value. Think of it as essentially integer value, right? So to save myself typos on this, I'm going to copy and paste my enabled and my timeout. Paste. There we go. Okay. Now what I want to do as well is run this again to get a different variable that is my shell service current, right? So if I do my shell service current dot get, we'll see that it's still enabled and it's still set to 0 timeout. We didn't actually set the service with our new configuration that we did. So let's do this again. And then let's do shell service current dot get. By now setting the configuration back to that service where we had the proper definitions of it being enabled, of it having a timeout to it, we can actually keep rerunning this code, and we see that we've enabled the shell service inside of the VMI, and it's counting down for our timeout. We give it 600 seconds for this thing. We can also validate this by going and looking, as long as I get into the right interface for this thing. Let me just copy this one. We can look at it either through the API, So let's do our shell. Let's do execute to see what this config is. And it shows us enabled. It shows our timeout is counting down. So if we keep executing it here and drill down, it's now 5:53. If we run it again, it's going to be like 5:50. And now if we go into the VMI itself, we can see it through the interface that we're typically used to seeing it, which is us logging in here. Okay. And if we go to access, we will see that the bash shell is enabled and it still has like an 8-minute timeout. So back to the original point of all of this, right? Rather than doing all of these 60 lines of PowerShell to SSH into the box and run 3 lines of code, when we're doing it through the API, once we know how to get to it, whether we do it through the API in a browser, whether we do it through the CIS service, we figure out there are 2 values that we're giving it of enabled, and then what's the timeout for this thing, and just telling it, here's your new configuration, set this, and it's done. Okay. The last 2 quick demos that we're going to do here, and this one's always fun, and this is typically what gets people to actually start playing around with this stuff, is creating a new VM via the API. I will tell you again, back to my point about all of the PowerShell and putting things in code stuff, right? Thinking about this to be something that you do as small iterations and changes that you make along the way. When you go to create a VM, this thing will show us inside of here that when we go, you know what, let me get into the docs for this real quick because it's easier to show in this view. vCenter APIs. When we go create a VM, the things that are actually required for this request are the guest operating system, which is an enumeration here, the placement, and then a string for the data store in the folder. To specify the name for the data store and the folder for the data store are not what it's looking for. It's looking for this managed object reference ID. So inside of this vSphere environment, let me go back into this one. The easy way you can find this is either by pulling information out of the API or by browsing around. And then once you get to the object you're looking for inside of your vCenter environment, you can just copy and paste stuff out of the URL, amazingly enough. So for now, I'm just going to go get the folder real quick just to show everybody. I know we're running over on time, so I'm trying to get through this one pretty quickly. But in my inventory for my folder here, what I'm trying to do is create a new VM in the API that will end up in this VMUG demo folder that's here. It's hard to see, but if you look inside of the URL that's here, you'll see there's this, at the end of this URN, there's vmommy and then a folder, semicolon, and then, or sorry, folder colon, and then group dash 5038. That's the ID for the folder that I'm trying to place it in for the placement of this VM spec. So that's the information that I've got to put inside of here. But again, we need a guest operating system. It needs a data store and a folder. I'm specifying which cluster to put it in my code, but that's it. These enumerations, any place you have a requirement of a specific defined value for these, they'll be listed in the documentation. So as a dummy shot on this thing, I'm putting one in to create a VM that's like a DOS VM, right? So let me, since I've logged into this one, let's get into the API Explorer over here. Why are you? Oh my goodness. I'm just getting booted out everywhere. Okay. All right, guys. All right. Hang on. Last 2 demos. Okay. So we're going to use 2 different methods to create a VM in the API. So I'm going to go ahead and cheat and copy my spec that I've got over here for my VM from the API. So what I'm defining here is a name for the VM, the guest operating system being DOS, the placement as far as which data store by ID, which folder by ID, and then which cluster that I'm trying to put it into. You can either get this information by going to these objects in the API and running the get method, and it gives you back the list of all of your data stores and folders and clusters, and then you copy and paste that ID. Or again, you can browse around to these objects inside of the GUI and just copy it out of the URL to get this stuff. But now I'm going to flip back over to our API Explorer, Developer Center, go to API Explorer for vCenter. And now what I'm going to do is tell it I'm going to create a VM. So I'm going to run this post method right here that says it creates a virtual machine. To create a VM, all I'm going to do is take my formatted request body. If you don't know the data type, if you don't know all the information you need, over here in the description, it shows you this expandable menu that you can copy and paste everything from. But since I have a working example, I'm going to run this from here. So I'm going to tell it again, name, guest OS, and then the placement information for data store, folder, and cluster. Hit execute. It's going to warn me this will actually cause modifications to your resources. Again, this is not testing it anywhere. This is doing it live on the server. The response I get back is the actual MoRef ID for the new VM that I've created. So let's go see if I have a vmug-api-vm when I go back and look at my VMs and templates. Inside of VMUG demo, I have a new VM that was created by API, right? With a handful of pieces of information. Again, not super useful because of the fact that all it's going to do is go provision this stuff. It's not going to have all of the bits that we need to like turn this thing on. But now that you know how to create a VM kind of a shell object, you can specify, here's the network I'm going to put it on. Here's the BIOS configuration I need for it. Here's the specific hardware spec that I need to have for this thing, right? Small iterations throughout. The last thing I want to do is do a quick run through in Postman of how to do this. If somebody has never seen Postman before, here's the crash course for it, right? We're going to start with running git VM. So I'm going to go to the, zoom in a little bit here because this is still not quite. There we go. So I'm going to the URL that's my vCenter server /API/vCenter/VM. And I'm going to say, I want to run a git method to get back all of my VMs. So we'll start here. And what happens is it says, oh, we're unauthenticated. If we remember back to the API docs, what we have to do first is create a session. So let's go create our session. So for this, I'm hitting the API session endpoint. I'm giving it my username and password under authorization with basic auth. This means I'm passing it username and password, right? When I run this, it gives me back that token that I need to use. So I can go back to get VM. I can change my authorization to an API key. And I have pre-formatted in here the key.
I'm a big fan of Postman. I used it a lot when I worked at Turbo.
Oh man,
VMware has a bunch of samples. So I posted a link in the chat where you can download and import some Postman resources and samples to be able to do some of the work. So Joe referenced this before, but I put the link in the chat if anyone wants to grab it and start playing around.
It's absolutely worth it to grab those examples, or honestly, even look at the Postman site in the documentation. They'll have examples for like playing with the Twitter API interactively, right? Get outside of stuff that is outside of your normal realm of tech and play with something that's a little bit more fun, or like use an API to go get the current weather information for your location, right? Some of that stuff, thinking about it in a different context might lead you to discovering and learning new things. So it's absolutely worth playing around with and picking up a new skill.
Yeah, and it's like PowerShell. You can, the way a lot of us get started with PowerShell is going out and searching for something to do what you want to do, and grabbing someone else's code and modifying it to do what you want it to do. With these API samples that VMware has, you can take the samples and then input your vCenter name, or like Joe said, use variables and kind of modify it to do what you want to do. So,
yep, absolutely.
Postman is a very powerful tool when you're working with with API.
Right.
So awesome. Thank you, Joe.
Yep.